Okay, well, I think we probably ought to start. Sorry about this black lozenge in the screen, which seems to pop up because of people in the waiting room. Not quite sure how to get rid of that. Anybody got any bright ideas? Let me know. Anyway, thank you all for coming tonight. It's been dreadful not seeing people, nearly a year now, but at least we can meet on Zoom. Some people have asked for this to be recorded, and because they can't join us tonight. So if anyone objects to being recorded, this is your chance to opt out or turn off your video or whatever. I'm going to talk about my parents. My father, Matyas Seiber, 1905 to 60, and Lilla Bauer, 1912 to 2011. My parents, their contribution to the cultural fabric, and a subtitle could be Circles, Parallels, and Coincidences. Apologies in advance, because this means I shall be darting back and forth in time. So you might find reference to this timeline particularly helpful. It's in 3 columns. My father on the left, mother in the middle, and on the right, somebody called George Budai, of whom more in a moment. Initially, however, I'd like to mention 3 people whom I never had the chance to meet, but never had the opportunity, although I would have loved to. Firstly, my maternal grandfather, the architect Emil Bauer, many of whose buildings still adorn Budapest, which I visited with my cousin in 2007. His work is now being recognized and is the subject of a dissertation. But my grandparents emigrated to Australia immediately after the war and before I was born. I knew by the age of 5 I did not want to be a musician, I did not want to be a dancer, but I did want to be an architect for most of my childhood. The second person, my uncle-in-law, Deja Keristuri, married to Matyas's sister Maria, a scholar, a poet, a minister of education and religion from 1945 to 7, a fascinating man, but sadly too ill and too old to see us when Simon and I first visited Budapest. On this slide, there is a picture of him, also a picture of the house which Emil built for his family in Buda. His most famous building, the semicircular cinema. There is also a copy of my father's birth record, and the other person is George Budai. He is the third person on that list I never met, a woodcut artist, my mother's lover from 1933 to 1938, and he features prominently on that first timeline sheet. Due to some remarkable coincidences, he and my mother parted for the last time in Szeged, in Hungary in 1938, but ended up living less than 10 kilometers apart in Surrey in the 1970s and 1980s. Best known analysis of my father's career is recorded in biographical and musical studies by others far better qualified to review them than am I. But some stories are less well known and still appeal. At the academy, his tutor was Kodai, but he was also known to Bartók. It was the latter who resigned from a panel adjudicating students' work when young Matyas's Wind Serenade was not allowed to win because of his Jewish antecedents and being a bit modern. Bartók left in indignation. The full serenade can be accessed on my YouTube. It is the first item in the Royal College of Music's concert broadcast, but here is a very short snippet. So that was the piece that Bartok liked, but nobody else on the panel was prepared to let pass. Matyas, it appears, was an outstanding pupil at the academy. His record book has been described to me as incredible, nothing there worse than excellent. And these are the pages of it from 1922 through to 1925, much of it signed by Kodai. He was part of Kodai's class of 25, traveling around and recording regional folk melodies, previously only passed down orally. Also in that group was Antal Dorothy, who resided in the same Budapest 6th District apartment block. This is a well-known photograph of the group on the Buda Hills, a picture of Bartok, a picture of my father in his first proper job in Germany, and an article he wrote on syncopation while he was there. Also, there is a list of the manifest of foreign passengers on the Hamburg line, America-Hamburg line, which I shall mention in a minute. Interest in folk music remained a strong influence, especially when later composing for his own London choir, the Dorian Singers. This brought to the fore things like the Hungarian folk songs, the Yugoslav folk songs, and the nonsense songs. There were also solo song cycles, several for tenor, Peter Pears, and the guitarist Julian Bream. Amongst these, the Greek folk songs, the French, old, medieval, and chanson populaire. All these cycles are on our third CD with Tyrone Landau. Hope you're here, Tyrone. But on this clip, this is from the States with somebody called Jonathan Pilkington singing them. Hope you're here too, Jonathan. A friend and colleague was Bert A.L. Lloyd, a renowned vocalist, a strong communist, a folk musicologist, and another multilinguist who advised on breathing for several of those cycles. Matyas found languages very easy and had 10 that I know of, including Latin and Greek, and he taught me the Greek alphabet when I was about 8. No help with Latin homework, however. It's obvious, isn't it, was the only remark I would get if asking for help with translation. Another anecdote, 1954, when travelling to Oslo Music Festival by ferry, he was sitting in the corner of the bar reading a book, while others were enjoying the beer. On reaching Norway, he was seen to be having a conversation with a local. Someone said, "I didn't know that you spoke Norwegian, Matyas." The answer, "I learnt it on the way here." When he was killed in South Africa, he'd been there 3 weeks, and he already spoke Dutch. I am sure he had added Afrikaans to his list. In my lifetime, he would disappear to music elsewhere, festivals all around Europe, Scandinavia, and most frequently Salzburg or Baden-Baden. Sometimes we would join him at the end, usually arriving by train in Italy for a holiday where my mother craved sunshine and Italian culture. Peeping out at the Basel station sign from my couchette window is a residing memory and always marked the start of a new adventure. Matyas's musical interests were always eclectic. His first proper job in 1927 was lecturer, then professor of jazz at Hochs Conservatorium in Frankfurt, the first academic study of jazz anywhere. But as degenerate music, it didn't please Hitler. The flowering of the Weimar Republic arts and music scene was systematically snuffed out, and the course forcibly closed down in 1933. Frankfurt had celebratory concerts in 2005 and 2010, and in January 2019 we had the fun of an evening in Berlin run by Musica Reanimata, some Seiber songs probably not performed by anybody for the intervening 80 or 90 years. On this slide, just a picture of the Liszt Academy in Budapest and the Hoch Conservatorium in Frankfurt. On leaving Frankfurt, after a brief return to Budapest, he worked as a music critic, a journalist, and travelled widely. This included revisiting the States, from whence came his original interest in jazz, acquired in 1926-7, playing cello in the string quartet on the America-Hamburg line. First-class passengers got a string quartet over dinner. Eventually, he reached London in 1935, speaking of pleasure, finding freedom of thought and speech there. For the first decade, he lived in the Hampstead Hungarian enclave, centred round Belsize Park. From there, he ran the London Podium Club with György Mikes, mainly to cheer up Hungarian émigrés, for whom he composed 2 operettas, Balaton and Bakers of Pelagi. The Hungarian Culture Centre hoped to reconstruct a podium evening for the 2020 anniversary celebrations, but like so much else, it was scuppered by COVID. The Royal College of Music, however, did manage to have their talks and concert go ahead in November, and this can be accessed on their and my YouTube, and some wonderful performances by their students, including the Wind Serenade you've just heard, and also by Norbert Mine of the To Poetry song cycle. And this slide shows Matyas and György Mikes at the Podium Club, Kodai visiting us in 1949, when I was about 6 months by the look of it, and also my father with his great friends, John Hallas and Joy Batchelor. Diversification ran through his career, and he did incidental music for radio, while The Invitation, his only major ballet, was composed much later and has also been the subject of a recent dissertation. In Hampstead, he befriended John Hallas and Joy Batchelor, who were busy revolutionising the history of UK animation. Many short public information films followed during and after the war, including To Your Very Good Health, which used the Charlie series character to introduce the idea of the NHS in 1948. The collaboration with Hallis and Batchelor created some wonderfully innovative films. The Abstract Magic Canvas, where the music Fantasia actually preceded the film. The Owl and the Pussycat, I think a personal favourite for both Vivian and myself. And ultimately the feature-length Animal Farm in 1954. Extracts of these you can find on my YouTube, supplied by Vivian, but here is just a snippet from the Magic Canvas. Matyas continued to write film music for Hallis and Batchelor and for others. The best known commercial item, probably A Town Like Alice. He found the general UK music scene on arrival conventional and also lacking in rigorous professional standards. His pupils had to work hard to both meet these requirements and produce something original. He continued composing jazz and light music, often under the pseudonym G.S. Matyas, because in those days it was not the done thing for serious composers to dabble in other genres. This he found very irritating, writing several articles explaining why the segregation was artificial. In his view, a composer should work across several genres. It was the amount and quality of craft applied to each task that mattered. His preference was composing chamber music, much for his beloved cello, but also a cappella. He was interested in plain chant and also in early instruments. His clavichord pezzo, which has been performed here in Cambridge twice in the last decade, and Shots are now publishing it, due out today, 10th of February. I haven't got my copy yet. He loved the fun of Lewis Carroll, was sensitive to the poetry of MacNeice and the language of Joyce, but once was challenged to compose a pop song for the top 20 and promptly did so by the Fountains of Rome, winning a Novello Prize. One of his later pieces, and by this time no pseudonym needed, was the collaboration with Johnny Dankworth, Improvisations for Jazz Band and Orchestra. His correspondence about this is quite hilarious, complaining, "This young man constantly changes dates, doesn't turn up for meetings. Is he serious about finishing this piece?" In London, his reputation flourished, both as a private tutor of composition and from 1942, part-time teaching at Morley College at the invitation of Michael Tippett. He was soon recognised as the best teacher of his generation and attracted a string of composer pupils from Europe, the UK, from Australia and South Africa. Many of these sadly have now died: Malcolm Lipkin, Andrew Milner, Peter Racine Fricker, Ingvar Littholm, Stanley Glasser and Don Banks, but a few still survive: Hugh Wood and Michael Graubart and Alan Gibbs. It was of Alan that Peter Evans expressed himself to be terribly envious over his proposed study with Matyas on Saturdays. He could think of no one, he said, in this country, or few elsewhere, with whom he would rather work. On this slide, we have him performing at the no, that's yes, you come back one. The premiere of the Horn Notturno with Dennis Brain. The program for a concert done for his 50th birthday at Morley College with the Amadeus Quartet and Peter Wolfish. There he is conducting the small orchestra for Animal Farm. And as I have recently discovered, the Royal College of Music also have a set of drawings by Milane Cosman, of which this is one. Matyas and Lilla met in London during the war, married in 1946, and then moved to Caterham, where I was brought up and where he mainly taught, so I met most of the pupils. Caterham was about 45 minutes from London, with nearby woods and fields, but carefully chosen as a branch line terminus, so if he fell asleep after a late concert, he could not overshoot. He continued composing for his choir, the Dorian Singers, and many renowned performers of the day, some already mentioned, and some here: Dennis Brain, the Amadeus Quartet, but also violin pieces for Max Rostar, Tibor Varga, and cello for Pleath. He was experimental too, and interested in Schoenberg and 12-tone music, writing articles to try and get that genre better understood. He was one of the founder members of the SPNM with Francis Chagrin, striving for the new music's acceptance. On the next slide, you can see some memorabilia, including the Novello Prize I mentioned, his stopwatch, which is still working, the Bartók Medal he was awarded in Hungary in 1956, and the well-known sketch of him by Gerard Hoffnung. He was a good friend, and Matyas took part in the Interplanetary Music Festival in 1958, which I do remember attending. That portrait now hangs over my desk for inspiration, and it captures well the impish sense of humour which produced the limericks, the Morgenstern Lieder, and the nonsense songs. The nonsense songs I last heard performed by the Argenteus Choir from Szeged University, directed by Gabor Kovac, at Cambridge, at Wolfson College, and again in Szeged. And their wonderful Seiber concert, so wonderfully arranged by Laci Stacho and introduced by Shoma Shiposh. I hope they're both with us too, and Gabor. That full concert is now on my YouTube, and here is a snippet from The Owl and the Pussycat with the guitarist David. He also knew one of the Hohner family, who complained at the lack of good teaching manuals for the accordions which his families famously made. So Matyas taught himself to play and produced an 8-part manual, still in use apparently. Our last concert in Cambridge before lockdown was of cello and accordion music, not a usual combination, but one he thought worth exploring. And here we have Veronica Henderson and Ian de Messini playing about a week later at Chatsworth.
This half is going to be
Galop Chromatique and other pieces from the concert you can find on my YouTube as well. Veronica Henderson and her pianist friend Jill Morton have been stalwarts for our Cambridge concerts for years. All the manuscript scores now reside in the British Library, and there too is his correspondence, a real treasure trove for musicologists. All those 20th century composers were continually writing to each other, and he knew everybody. The British Library catalogue provides a great resource, provided, of course, you read Hungarian, French, Italian, German, English, and Dutch. You could find a great deal in there. Still to be catalogued are the scrapbooks, and the sound archive at the British Library also has some of his recordings. On this slide, there are just some examples. A handwritten score of the Credo for the Missa Brevis, the cache from the British Library, a page from the correspondence index, and the label of the record he did about his talk on Kodai in 1943. Florian Schedding, now senior music lecturer at Bristol, did his PhD thesis on Seiber some years ago and has now produced a good book, Musical Journeys. Shoma Sheposh at the Kodai Institute in Kecskemét is also currently working on his doctoral dissertation on Seiber. Both were interested in James Joyce settings, and Ulysses is perhaps the best regarded of all his works. Composed in 1947-8, we have it on one of our CDs, but I last heard it in Carnegie Hall in 2010 as part of the 50th anniversary celebrations by the American Symphony Orchestra conducted by Leo Botstein, and there is a short snippet of it here. That is the scene where they come out of the house and confront the night sky, which I think is quite wonderful. In 1960, however, he was killed. Kodai composed a beautiful lament on the death of his star pupil, and Keresturi also wrote a moving obituary. I was only 11 when he was killed, so much of what we would have talked about during my teenage years never got discussed. I don't recall my father ever speaking about his family and his early life in Budapest at all, so it has taken a great deal of piecing together. Maria, his sister, the first female organist pupil at the academy, married Keresturi in 1932, and there is lengthy correspondence between Deja and Matyas, some concerning Maria's declining mental health. Their brother, whom my father always called Georgi, it appears from official documents, was actually called Joseph. Shoma has sent me information about Joseph's record production company, which survived through to the 1950s. Also about his studio address, and has recently also unearthed more articles on the family together with Keresturi and Kodai. My grandmother, Matyas's mother, taught piano. The head archivist István at Newgate Station has showed me the records of his father, Mihai, who was a chief railway engineer. He has also found several birth and marriage certificates for me from both sides of the family. In 1990, Simon and I first went to Hungary, driving in near Sopron, circling the country, meeting my cousin Eva in Budapest, and going to Szeged, our then twin city as of 1987. We also went to the village of Balaton-Boglar to see if we could identify a summer house, which my father bought for himself and his parents well before the war. My mother was surprised to receive a request from tenants in the early 80s, which she kindly repaired the leaking roof, which you can see in the middle picture. We didn't know if it still existed, but yes, there it was, repaired, decorated, and the new owner's name on the local land registry. They actually invited us in for a cup of tea. So those are 3 pictures of the house, Rosika, at various stages. My meeting with cousin Eva, and also 2 family snaps. One of my parents about the time I was born, and one of a family holiday in Italy about 6 years later. The investigation process really began in late 2004 as the centenary of Matyas's birth was approaching, and several things coincided. The setting up of the trust with 2 former pupils, Hugh Wood and Alan Gibbs, together with others, Nigel Bonham Carter and Bob Hanson, who was the inspiration for and the director of the Morley College week-long exhibition and concert. Almost simultaneously, I heard from the cellist Peter Sabel of the Budapest Festival Orchestra, which eventually led to the first Hungaraton CD, mainly cello and piano pieces, for which I spent about a week in Budapest in the summer of 2005, becoming friends with the pianist Zsuzsa Kollár and taking with me the English soprano Leslie Jane Rogers, who was willing to take part. From that first CD, there are now 6 covering the a cappella work, guitar and tenor song cycles, the Joyce settings, clarinet pieces done by Kilian Herold in Germany. The next of film music has taken time to get off the ground, but Vivian and I are hopeful. There are also several mixed compilations in the lower right-hand corner, including some of the jazz pieces done by Ebony Band. All royalties and performing rights go to the trust. This helps fund the CDs. It helps cross-subsidise Cambridge Szeged Society's musical activity, and it provides study grants. In 2005, I also became the chair of the Cambridge Szeged Society, dedicated to enhancing ties with our twin city and interest in Hungarian culture generally. And I have been there every year since, except 2020. Everything meshed together very nicely, a platform to develop interest in and promoting Seiber music through Cambridge concerts and in Hungary, and the various ensuing CDs. Since then, I've taken 5 Cambridge choirs out, and Mentes Meskent, the folk ensemble from Szeged, have been here every year since 2011, twice with their school group. Szeged University Argenteus Choir has been here once. We have also had art, medal and embroidery exhibitions and other exchanges. Despite Brexit, we aim to continue. Here is a poster of some of the concert posters and pictures of the choirs and their posters in Hungary as well. My father was kind, if rigorous. His articulate and pragmatic side, saying composing is a practical task like making shoes, encompassed his leisure pursuits of photography, climbing and cross-country skiing, but did definitely not extend to household DIY. I don't think he ever learnt to wire a plug. My mother had stories of him turning up during his courtship of her at her Baker Street flat with his pork chop ration for the week, asking how to cook it. Fortunately, she was a very good cook and pretty good at DIY as well, both skills which she imparted to me. 2020 has been desperate for all musicians, but in the summer, Aspidistra Drawing Room Orchestra cheered me all up by sending me this, a recording of La Morenita, which they'd all obviously done remotely. And Norbert Mine, whom you'll have to find on my YouTube, we haven't time for it now, did a wonderful performance of the song cycle to poetry as well. Now we come to my mother, Lilla Bauer, principal dancer with the modern Ballet Russe, who entered Matyas's life in London, where after surviving the Blitz, they married in April 1946. Her young life had been pretty colourful. She was the youngest of 3 sisters, born in 1912. Her mother, a housewife, cook, and collector of Hungarian embroidery. Her father, the well-known architect Emil, already mentioned. Her parents and her eldest sister converted to some evangelical Protestant sect in the mid-1930s. The middle sister, with whom she did not get on at all, married a town planner, Eric Valer, and became ultra-Jewish. My mother remained agnostic, but in her 80s rather, decided that Quaker simplicity was the best life approach. Quite how, why, where she initially decided to train as a dancer in Budapest is unclear, but her talent was spotted early, and with 2 scholarships, she became a principal dancer with the modern ballets, aged only 19 or 20, touring Europe and the USA with them. She performed in most of his famous works, The Green Table and The City, and she became and remained good friends with the choreographer Rudolf Laban, developer of Laban notation for recording modern dance steps, a tool she used throughout her working life as modern dance lecturer. Heine Heckroth, the costume designer, was also a friend and gave her the picture you see at the top left of that screen. I don't, unfortunately, have a video of her moving, but from these frames you can see something of the joy and movement which she expressed. The other picture there is of a bronze bust done of her by Vilmos Levi, who was very briefly her husband, about whom I knew absolutely nothing for many, many years. And I still know nothing about him, apart from I have that bust. Curiously, Simon's grandmother was also interested in the dance company and had a book with 2 pictures of Lilla during her years with Jos. He started in Essen when she joined in 1932, moved to Dartington Hall to escape the Nazis in 1934-5, and the lower picture there is of her exercising on the Dartington lawn. They were, however, unable to return there at the early part of the war and went instead to 9 Adams Road, Cambridge, a most extraordinary house which I visited 2 years ago. But Lilla had left them to form her own company by the time they moved there. In 1937-38, she decided to set up her own company in Budapest. And in 1937, there was an article praising her intelligence and beauty and a recent Budapest performance. She was much photographed by her friend, Marianne Reisman. She still had her visa, however, from her Jos travels, and taking her parents' advice, used it to leave the country. In 1938, after her last Hungarian performance, which was in Szeged, a production she did of Madach's Tragedy of Man on the open-air stage. This was in the open-air theatre in Domtower. She never returned to the country and settled in London later in 1938. On the right, you have the article in the magazine about her performance, and also a picture of her with her parents, which is very difficult to see. Photographs by Marianne Reisman in the middle, and on the left, a portrait by Budai. Lilla was beautiful and spectacular on stage. Her poise, even in later years when teaching, was still quite arresting to watch. In 2019, I was invited to give a talk, initially for the Laban Institute and later for Insiders Outsiders at their Festival of Dance Symposium, about her and her many decades at Goldsmiths College. There cannot have been many modern dance students in the country who were not either taught by or examined by her during those decades. It was shortly before giving the second of those talks that I discovered more portraits by Budai than the one you've got in front of you there. Two things happened, or still about 2009. Firstly, she received a letter from the Pötöfi Museum in Budapest requesting permission to display her letters from Budai during their long relationship from 33 to 38. These she had left with her friend and confidant, Marianne Reisman, with instructions that if she did not return to the country, they were to be destroyed. She didn't return. Marianne did not destroy the letters. After getting over this shock and after reading them carefully, she gave permission, and they were part of the exhibition along with that portrait. At about the same time, Szeged Town Hall asked me to check on Budai's burial details. I knew that in the 1980s, someone had told my mother that he was living in the Netherlands Mental Hospital in Coulsdon, very close to her home. She had written to see if he wanted her to visit, but he had said no. With no relations and dying in that institution, in 1990, he was buried on consecrated ground in Red Hill in the county graveyard in Surrey. He had been in the Netherlands for 20 years by then. This is his self-portrait on the cover of the book. He had a shed in the gardens, which he regarded as his pavilion, and continued to work there. Also on this slide, a picture, my favorite picture of my mother dancing, which is an incredible leap and quite difficult to do. At her 97th birthday, she's still holding forth in the garden. And then when she died in 2011, at the age of 99, she was finally buried with my father. And Geza Fabre and Tundif from Szeged came there just before I sold the house, I think, and did a beautiful lament at the graveside. Her lengthy retirement after Goldsmiths, during which she developed artistic interests in pottery and weaving, at the age of 98 and a half, early in 2011, she decided that living in a large house on a steep hillside garden was probably not safe. The care home she lived in for her last half year was 5 minutes walk from Budai's grave. I don't think she ever realized. She died soon after her 99th birthday in August 2011 and is now reunited with my father in that grave in the Caterham graveyard. I told the story of these repeated coincidences in Szeged in 2014 to much amazement, the parallel and never again crossing paths. Budai found the Netherlands a peaceful haven, and while there was commissioned to illustrate the folio edition of Darkness at Noon. But how had he got there? In London, he was there during the war and set up what later became the Hungarian Cultural Centre, and the British Library catalogue does list one letter between him and my father. He was never granted British citizenship, mainly due to meddling by MI5, and this and the failure of the 1956 uprising broke his spirit, and his last 20 years was spent in the Netherlands. Coincidentally, my father was in Budapest, giving a conducting tour in October 1956. Somebody, I don't know who, possibly Keresztúri, advised him to leave, and he came home 3 days early on October the 21st. That was the last time he saw his homeland, and Lilla never saw it after 1938. But that's not quite the end of the story. In 2019, as I mentioned, I gave those 2 talks, and I was looking something up about Budai on the internet, and up popped that portrait, the one you've seen already, but said it was in the British Museum, not in Budapest, which was a surprise. I phoned them, spoke to the print room, and was told they had 2 folders of his work. I explained who Lilla was. There's only one portrait which actually names her, but I normally only put the year and the location. And I was invited to go and see the folders. I spent an extraordinary afternoon, some 14 portraits of her staring back at me. Clearly, he went on tour with the ballet, doing numerous pictures of her on and off stage, in and out of clothes, including several of The Tragedy of Man, and several in Rome and 2 in Transylvania, where his family lived, although he settled in Szeged. The best portraits could be the closing chapter here. In the 1980s, Bodai said he wanted to remember her as she had been, and the Transylvanian portrait in the middle was, in fact, how she remained for very many years. But these, I think, are the best of her, including the one that is named Lilla. I like to think of my 2 émigré parents contributing to cultural fabric during their lifetime, and in death ending up in the quintessentially institutions of the British Library and the British Museum. So thank you all very much for listening. This is just a picture of the trustees. The last lunch, I think, that Bob Hanson was well enough to attend shortly before he died, but the rest of us still keep going. Thank you all very much for attending, and I hope to meet you all again soon. Do let me know of any questions you may have. I can see there are things in the chat box, so I'll have a look. There also is the YouTube for anybody to have a look at.
Thanks, Julia. It's lovely.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Interesting.
So interesting, Julia. Really.
Thanks, Viv.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Impressioning.
That was great.
Why don't we see who else is there?
This was a fantastic talk, Julia. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We wrote
Oh,
here.
Monday.